preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Each Tuesday evening when I come into the art gallery, I'm very strongly tempted to try to see what intuitive genius has arranged the paintings for that evening so as to be appropriate to that evening's lecture. I confess the wonderful abstractions mounted on the wall this evening seem very appropriate to me, either as a subject on which to start this evening's lecture, or perhaps really as a description of American Jewry. Because that's what we're talking about now, about American Jews and who they are and how they think of themselves as Jews. You know, you look around at the pictures and you wonder what in the world to make of it. Some of them are bright and glaring, a characteristic of American Jewry. On the occasions when you find a few sharply defined lines, it turns out to be a little bit of canvas and a little bit of burlap, about the same kind of odds and ends that one finds in the American Jewish community. And most of the rest of them look terribly mixed up, which is, I guess, about where we all are. At any rate, whoever arranged it for tonight gave us something of the picture that perhaps we have to feel as we turn from the middle of the 19th century toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century with American Jewry. Beginning with the 1880s, perhaps already felt in the 1870s, but beginning with the 1880s, a statistic begins to make itself felt on the American Jewish community. It is the immigration statistic. Through the 60s and 70s, the dominance of the German Jewish community with their Reform Judaism, which we described last week, was quite clear. They remained the dominant community well into the First World War, and perhaps to some extent have always been the dominant community in the American Jewish community. But beginning in the 70s, and certainly in the 80s and 90s, a statistic is available which indicates that this was not long to be the case. It is simply the number of Jews from Eastern and Central Europe who were coming to the United States. If one figures that the American Jewish community was by now somewhat sizable, over 1 million people, although the figure is somewhat difficult to arrive at as one moves toward the end of the 19th century. And you realize that between 1880 and World War I, 1.5 million Jews came into the United States. And that immediately after World War I, another 250,000 Jews, in the few years before the immigration was cut off, arrived in this country from Eastern and Central Europe. One begins to see what happened. That an old Jewish community in the United States, which was settled and adapted and had established a way of life, was simply inundated in terms of sheer numbers by the Jews arriving from Russia and what today would have to be called Poland, from Bulgaria and Romania and that part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which we would know as Czechoslovakia and its environs. One has to stop and wonder, I think, what would have happened to the American Jewish community if this immigration had not taken place. Supposing the German Jews had remained the central Jewish community, what if the immigration had been to Argentina, as some of it was, or to other parts of South America? Supposing the Jews had all gone to Palestine. Supposing they'd gone to South Africa, as many of them did. Suppose instead of hundreds of thousands, and mind you, 100,000 a year coming into the United States for well over 10 or 15 years. Supposing instead of that, they had only come by hundreds, or maybe a few thousand a year. Something that the German Jewish community of the United States could have easily absorbed. How different American Jewish life would be to this day. It's a little interesting to speculate on what it might have been like. There would have been the same kind of organization, perhaps, of American Jewish life that we knew. Perhaps it would even be organized a little better. It would be predominantly a religiously centered, and I guess largely a Reform Jewish way of life. perhaps rather more classical than we find it now, that is classically Reformed Jewish, looking more like a rather well-organized American church than what we see it to be in our own day. It's a little idle to speculate, of course, because it didn't happen. And yet, if we don't speculate, you may not see how important this immigration was. Of course, one should note at the same time that it wasn't just Jews who were immigrating to the United States. Lots of people were coming to the United States. The country itself changed. We can't really imagine what the United States would be like if the Jews didn't come, because it wasn't just the Jews who were coming. Lots of people were coming, and Eastern and Southern Europe was the source of a tremendous migration to this country. Now, the key factor for us is not just that these people came, but that they came in such a way that the German Jewish community was no longer able to maintain itself as the central community. There were too many of the immigrants. They came almost like ants. And they came to this country at such a rate that although the older community was English-speaking and established and had its institutions, it couldn't absorb them quickly enough. It couldn't take these immigrants in as one would do with 2 or 10 or 20 or 100 and help them bridge the gap between their immigrant status and what the older group had achieved. As a result, something new came into being, a cleavage, a split between the older German Jewish community, which is by now well adapted to the United States and well settled in its economic, education, and political life, and the new immigrants, who were still largely Europeans, still largely the bearers of their European tradition. They were the famous greenhorns, those who not only had an immigrant status, but somehow stuck to it or clung to it for reasons which we will see. A cleavage begins between these two Jewish communities, which only in our own time have we begun to see disappear. And it is because of this cleavage that a whole development takes place in American Jewish history and even in the development of the Jewish religion. Now let's spend a moment on this immigrant group, these people who from 1880 to 1925 transformed the American Jewish community. Who were they? They were largely Jews from Russia, the Russia of whom we spoke when we discussed how the Haskalah movement turned into Zionism. You will recall what that Russia was. That was the Russia when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, the so-called liberal Tsar, that went even more reactionary, that instituted the infamous May laws, which were to see to it that what few rights Jews possessed in the country were taken away. There was economic as well as political oppression. And there was the feeling among the Jews of Russia that they never would win their rights there except by dire revolution. It was with these May laws in 1880 that the Jewish immigration from Russia began. It began with rather a flood in 1881, and it went downhill slowly till the early 1890s. But from 1890 on, it went up and went up steadily and stayed there at over 100,000 a year until World War I. These were Russian Jews who live in what today very often would have to be called Poland. There was no Poland at that time, you will recall. And therefore their Judaism was not the Judaism of the previous generation. The previous group of immigrants had been Germans, part of the German society, who had tasted a certain kind of freedom, who had tasted the opportunity of economic participation, of political participation, and very often even of educational participation. You'll recall that when Isaac Mayer Wise arrived in the country in the 40s, that he had a university degree as well as having a rabbinical ordination. But when one deals now with this overwhelming group of immigrants from Eastern Europe, one is dealing now with a group that came from another kind of culture. Most of them came from the small communities, which were largely Jewish communities. These were the settlers of the shtetl, Or they came from those very large communities into which the Jews had been so tightly packed that they formed practically an autonomous enclave. These were not people who had known freedom. They had not been given the opportunity to become emancipated. By and large, although I'm using the term loosely, they were the children of the ghetto. They had felt the currents of modern liberalism and democracy sweeping through the air. Yes, they'd heard of them. They thought of them. And they dreamed of the great America, the golden America, as they called it, in which there was economic opportunity, in which there was a chance to live at peace. These were the people whose sons were taken to the army and conscripted by kidnappers for 25-year periods of time. America was a country where boys were not conscripted into government service. You recall how recently it is that we've had a draft in the United States in the peacetime in which everyone has had to serve a term. This was a symbol of what it meant to be an American. So these people who came to the United States were not the citizens of modern culture or of modern democracy. And their Judaism, therefore, was therefore the traditional Judaism, almost of the ghetto period. Oh, to be sure, there were groups who came in who reflected some of the movements that we have spoken about. There were the Zionists and the Hebraists. There were the Yiddishists, of whom we shall say more in a few moments. But by and large, theirs was a Judaism which had not been exposed to the freedom and the intermingling which has been so characteristic of the Western countries. Now, not only therefore did they come essentially as traditional Jews, essentially as observant Jews by and large, except for the deviant movements, but more than that, they came and settled in the country in an unusual way. They came and settled in the large cities, particularly along the eastern seaboard. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, and then later the inland cities, began to have tremendous numbers of Jews. They settled very solidly in neighborhoods and compacted their residence. Earlier generations had been part of an American sweep toward the west. These people went west too, but they didn't disperse themselves over the country in quite the same way that the German Jews had done. The German Jews had, so to speak, sprinkled themselves all across the eastern half of the United States. The country was moving west in the middle of the 19th century. The pace of the economic development and the tempo had drawn people westward. But by the time one gets to the end of the 19th century and the closer one approaches World War I, all this has slowed down. And there's better opportunities in the large cities where industrialization is taking place, where small factories are opening up day after day after day. And one therefore gets a special kind of settlement. One gets vast neighborhoods in which block after block after block are solidly packed with Jews. And they have a special economic problem as well. Since the country is not moving as fast as it had during the middle of the 19th century, they don't have the opportunity that the German Jew had before them, namely of moving rather quickly and easily with the stepped-up tempo of America, the pack on the back and the little store which becomes the big store which grows with America. The opportunities are there, to be sure, and the living is much better than they have had in Eastern Europe. But by now it's got to be the kind of living where most of them go into industry. The rise now is of a Jewish laboring class. And certain industries particularly begin to have a very large Jewish group in them. Simply because a man who came to this country over such fearful distances would chance to either find someone of his town or someone of his family who had come before him. And he would allow him to steer him then into certain trades. The needle industries particularly are the best example. The needle industries, from the bosses to the contractors to the little shops, were spread thick and through with Jewish workers from Eastern Europe in large chains, both of familial and geographic and other ties. Now, it's not hard to understand how this kind of a settlement, which was so different from the essential German Jewish settlement, caused the split of which I spoke in the community. And it's interesting to see how the German Jews attempted to deal with the problem. The German Jews who had been there before saw these people coming in, who lived in their neighborhoods and occupied a certain lower socio-economic class, particularly economic and therefore also social. They saw them speaking not the English language as quickly, because living in their neighborhoods and working together in industries which were largely Jewish, they could hope to maintain Yiddish as their natural language. I'm sure anyone who has had any acquaintance with New York has heard the stories of the Irish policeman who worked on the Lower East Side, who knew how to speak Yiddish as well as any Jew of the area. He had to, in order to be able to know simply how to get along. Or of the many non-Jews who were involved in the needle trades who had to learn Yiddish in order to survive in that industry. Now the German Jew, who was established in America, who had made his way, who had overcome the pain of giving up his immigrant status and becoming now part and parcel of America, reacted to the wave of newcomers with a feeling of almost shock. It was a fear, it was a worry, and it was a quite natural one. After all, how long had the Jews had their rights? How long had it been that these German Jews themselves, a generation or two back, had been citizens of the ghetto? As a result, seeing these newcomers come in, who were retaining, not giving up, but retaining all of the older signs of their Jewishness, it came as a threat to their new American status. These German Jews, who by and large now were settled in the community and economically had made good, saw the coming of this large mass of Eastern European Jews as a possibility of their losing their status. And they tried a number of very interesting devices to overcome the problem before they were simply swamped with it. One of the most famous is one that is but a footnote in history, but it's interesting. They tried what was known as the Galveston Plan. They got together and tried to work through what was at that time the greatest port on the Gulf of Mexico and the key entryway into Texas. And there, through the agency of a famous rabbi named Henry Cohen, they sought to set up an opportunity for Eastern European Jews to go through Galveston and be settled either in Texas or in the great heartland of the United States. The theory being, of course, that if the Jews could go to these areas, there was in the first place much more room for them, Texas in those days being the largest state in the United States, and in addition to which, there being then the whole interior of the United States which they could get to. If the Jews didn't settle in such large numbers on the eastern seaboard, there was some hope, therefore, that they might mix and mingle with Americans more. They might become part of the general process. Notice what this is. This is a kind of fear. It's a worry. It's an insurance policy, a kind of protection against the damage which the intruders will do. But the Galveston Plan failed. It couldn't succeed. It couldn't succeed because, by and large, these people had their own ideas of where they wanted to go. And America is a free country. And they had relatives and once liked the people from their hometowns and their home areas, and that was the safest way. And this was largely the way the immigration went, the German Jews to the contrary notwithstanding. Now, I've given you this rather nasty picture of them only because this was the root of the cleavage, which resulted in part of the animosity that still exists between conservative and Reform Judaism. I give you that, but I also have to say at the same breath that the German Jews did many worthwhile things for the immigrants. For example, they organized and saw to it that the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society carried on a process of bringing people into the country, getting them settled, seeing to it that many of the difficulties that were in their way were smoothed out. They did establish schools for them to learn English, to become citizens. The settlement houses were a key to this period. And the settlement houses were almost entirely financed and very often manned on their boards by German Jews who had been here for a long period of time. When the Kishinev pogroms broke out in Russia in 1904, it was the German Jews who organized the American Jewish Committee, which was to serve as an agency for giving the voice of American Jewry to the Russian government for its treatment of Jews. You mustn't see it all as black. They were Jews and they were brothers. The German Jews did reach forth to help them, but their power in the Jewish community was being threatened, as they somehow recognized over a long-range period of time, and their status as Americans, they were afraid, was also in danger. Now it's interesting to see what this overwhelming mass of Jews, these people who today compose the overwhelming majority of American Jews or their descendants, it's interesting to see how they then interpreted their Jewish identity on the American scene. After all, if the German Jews thought of themselves here in the United States as being members of a religious group, or of those who banded together occasionally to carry out certain communal purposes for their group, it's interesting to see how these East European Jews who came out of another milieu, who settled in another way, who had a different kind of economic circumstance, who felt themselves somehow cut off from and different from this original German Jewish group, it's interesting to see how they thought of themselves as Jews. Now, in the first place, particularly for those of you that know anything about the great metropolitan cities, it's quite clear that by and large, the question of Jewish status didn't arise for them. They weren't really concerned consciously with what it meant to be a Jew in the United States. And the reason for that was that they lived in largely Jewish communities. They had settled in Jewish neighborhoods. And even in the area of first settlement, it was possible to hear people speaking Yiddish on the street and to see Jews walking up and down, traditional Jews wearing earlocks and beards and kaftans, and having things for sale in the area of the neighborhood which were Jewish things. One simply lived in a Jewish community. Everybody was a Jew. Why should there be any question about what it meant to be a Jew? In a way, this was a carryover of what they had known in Eastern and Central Europe. There they were Jews because they lived in Jewish communities. And although it is true that the Jewish community was permeated by religion, here it's necessary to point out, lest you forget it, that the first and the basic level upon which they understood themselves to be Jews was because, well, everybody around whom they lived and with whom they associated tended to be Jewish. Now, that's obviously not completely true, and it can't be applied to every place that the Eastern European Jews settled. But by and large, the characteristic of the settlement of these Jews, particularly in the 10s and the 20s, was the fact that they lived in a neighborhood where other people were Jews, and that's what made them Jews. To this day, therefore, one of the major problems of attracting Jews in the United States to some kind of Jewish activity has been the fact that the overwhelming majority of American Jews are settled in large cities. Some 60% of them are settled in the eastern seaboard major areas, if one takes in their suburbs today. And it's precisely in these large cities where a Jew can still be a Jew by living in a certain neighborhood, where even though he's moved from the first area of settlement on the Lower East Side or the Bronx, out now to certain other areas, these are still areas in which there are so many people who are Jews around that this is enough to make one a Jew. But this is only a basic and a sociological fact. It describes why the larger the city, the less Jews there are affiliated with any Jewish organization, particularly a religious organization. These Jews brought with them something special, something unique on the American scene, and something which looked for a while as if it might have possibility of carrying out an idea that no one else had been able to carry out anywhere else. And that was they brought with them a whole style of Yiddish culture. I say Yiddish culture because it's a little hard to define it. There were Yiddish songs, there was Yiddish theater, there was a Yiddish press, one of the key factors of which was the Yiddish novel. There was Yiddish poetry. There were groups which met in a literary way to discuss and to debate. There was a whole Jewish labor movement with its entire question of what should be done in major unions and industries to carry out proper working conditions, which was based upon the Yiddish language. Now, a man who participated in this kind of activity didn't have to ask himself why he was a Jew. He was a Jew because he spoke Yiddish, because he participated in the culture. It was a whole way of life. He lived it. If he participated in a Yiddish-speaking labor union, he was part of its struggle for better welfare. And the tremendous work that these labor unions did, particularly in the garment industries, to establish decent working conditions, to establish an ethical relationship between employers and employees, have gone through the entire United States labor movement. But what was born here, therefore, was something which was not nationalistic. Because this wasn't any effort to get people to go to Palestine. Nor was it anything like Dubno had spoken about by saying we are a Jewish nation whose nationality is to be preserved through the Yiddish language. Nor was it religious, since many of the people who were strongly involved in the Yiddish revival in the United States, it wasn't a revival then, it was still alive, they weren't religious. But one could buy, and one can still buy, a Yiddish daily newspaper in the United States. One could read it, one could sing it, one could go to theater and have performances of all kinds in it. It looked as if for a moment there was going to be born in the United States a new kind of Jew. A Jew who had free and equal opportunities to mix and mingle in his society, and yet a Jew who was going to be a Jew by virtue of carrying over certain ties he had brought with him from Europe, by carrying over a language which he had spoken and which he was now making the means of his secondary expression in the United States. It is in a way, therefore, something of a shame to have to report that what at one time looked like one of the great experiences of the Jewish people in finding its way in the New World has largely disappeared. It's not dead yet. Of the 3 daily Yiddish papers in the United States, in the New York City area rather, which is the heartland of this kind of way of life, one of the Yiddish newspapers has had to merge with a second one. And the 2 of them managed to keep going. A third one, the Forvitz, frankly confesses that it runs at a deficit year after year, but had piled up such huge reserves in the days when it was doing well that its reserves will keep it going for quite a period of time. The Yiddish theater is gone today. We have recently been told that in order to keep the Yiddish theater alive, a new auditorium is to be built to preserve it. But it's an auditorium with 232 seats in it, as I recall. It's therefore a museum, a place in which to cherish the past and to look at relics. And the schools which once taught Yiddish, this flourishing educational chain which sought to teach this kind of culture, they're still flourishing, and a good number of them are around the city. But in the suburbs, they teach their children in English. They teach a non-religious Judaism in the English language. To me, it's a kind of a parody, a kind of a pathetic result of what was once a great movement. One has to see here something that the German Jews didn't have. It was the sense of the folk, of the people, of what living together as a community, of being a social entity could mean to them. It wasn't just that they were living together in their neighborhoods. They wanted to be together. They felt the importance of having the community. They felt the importance of having the community carry on its own kinds of activity, its own way of life. They weren't so ready to give up what was theirs, what they had managed to achieve over centuries of living in Eastern Europe. It was this sense of peoplehood, of being a group, which was critical to them. And finally, this was a group whose religious response to the United States was far more traditional than the German Jews had been. When they came to the United States, they came with the traditional Jewish background. But more than coming with the traditional Jewish background, more than coming really out of the ghetto, they found liberalism in the hands of the Germans. And you must understand what that meant. To be a Reform Jew meant to be a German Jew. And the cleavage between those who were in the American community and those who were not in. The European cleavage between the East European and the West European. And the whole sense of social and economic difference made the transition from what they had known in Eastern Europe to Reform Judaism well nigh impossible. It would have meant not just a religious reversal. The people have accomplished that in rather fast time. But there was a whole social, what shall I say, antipathy, a whole social emotion, a whole kind of feeling, almost prejudice, deep-seated prejudice, which made Reform Judaism impossible. Those of you that are old enough to remember hearing Eastern Jews speaking about German Jews know what I am talking about. Until intermarriage, notice the phrase I have to use, until intermarriage between German Jews and East European Jews became possible, an American Jewish community couldn't really emerge. And it's only in the 30s and in the 40s that this has really begun to happen, and that the old nationalistic lines and prejudices, even among Jews, have begun to fall away. So as a result, with this migration, there begins to be born a strong Orthodox sentiment in the United States. A very strong Orthodox sentiment. I wish I could say it was an Orthodox movement. If I said movement, I would tend to imply by that it was organized, directed, led, that it worked together. But it wasn't that. The great failure of Orthodoxy in the United States, without saying anything about it internally, has been the inability of Orthodox Jews to unite and present their point of view with the strength and the dignity that it deserves. It has been the failure to make Orthodoxy merge its strength so that Orthodoxy could appear on the American scene as a leader of the American community and not just as a follower lagging behind the other movements. Orthodoxy has never been able in the United States, as it has, for example, been able to in Britain, made itself seem part of the American scene until very recently. It's only since World War II, and now particularly with Herman Woke and This Is My God, that Orthodoxy now has an American label stamped on it. To that respect, Orthodoxy has tended to lag both behind Reform, which was the original American Judaism, and the conservative movement to which I am now coming. And yet Orthodoxy as such in the United States was subject to the fact that America was a free country. The fact remains that while people lived in neighborhoods that were largely Jewish, as they began to become part of America, as their children went to school, as they went to college, since education was the royal road to American accomplishment, as the immigrants themselves began to move from the area of first settlement to second settlement, as slowly they became part of the American civilization, all sorts of compromises and changes and questions about the old Judaism were forced upon them. Now here they were in a very unusual and interesting dilemma, interesting to us who are watching the development of something new. What happened? What happened was fairly simple. They couldn't be Reform because the Reform Jews represented something that was impossible to them. They couldn't simply think of themselves as German Jews. On the other hand, slowly but surely, the movement of social change, as a modern scholar would look at it, was bringing them away from the older, more traditional Orthodox observance to something which needed to change. And as a result, the conservative movement was born. You will recall that we tried some months earlier in this course to show you how the conservative movement traced itself back to the reaction against Reform Judaism in Germany, and how with Zacharias Frankel and a number of the other scholars of the German Jewish period, it seeks to find its roots there. On the other hand, as a movement, as an ideology, if it can be called that, Conservative Judaism considers itself primarily an American movement. It was born on the soil of America, the only Jewish movement which can claim that right and that privilege. And it was born out of the conflict between the equal impossibilities of Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. And to this day, the strongest appeal of conservative Judaism has been because of the rejection of either extreme. To this day, the strength of conservative Judaism comes from the fact that it rejects Reform Judaism as being too radical, even though today it can't claim that it's German anymore, since it's hard to tell these days who was a German Jew, at least of the pre-Hitler period or not, and who is not a German Jew in a Reformed congregation or anywhere else. And it rejects orthodoxy as not being willing to change sufficiently. The Rabbinical Assembly, the conservative rabbis group, recently issued a book which has a title that I think sums up the conservative movement very well. The book was a book in which excerpts are given from various speakers and thinkers in the conservative movement. It attempts, therefore, to give the thinking process, the ideology, the philosophy of conservative Judaism. And they called it Tradition and Change. That's a wonderful title. That's exactly what the conservative Jew says of himself. The Reform Jews are not traditional enough. They're not Jews, they're Goyim. I can't be part of them. To associate myself with Reform Judaism means somehow not to be a Jew. On the other hand, to associate myself with Orthodoxy isn't modern enough. I need to change. I want to develop. I want to be part of America and move with the time. It's tradition and change. Conservative Judaism, therefore, is born as a kind of a reaction movement, a response against other kinds of movements which exist. And I shall not forget Selo Baron, the famous Jewish historian at Columbia University, who commented once in a lecture that there really can't be a conservative Judaism in a country unless there's a Reform Judaism first. Because conservative Judaism is really a reaction against Reform, as well as a development away from Orthodoxy. Certainly that was true in the United States. Now, the key act in the development of conservative Judaism in the United States took place because a group of German Jews had an idea. Now I come back to the Galveston Plan in another direction. A group of German Jews who have variously been described as well-meaning, altruistic, humanitarian, thoughtful, and the like, decided that it would be helpful if what was at that time a rather small and insignificant and not very well-functioning rabbinical school called the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which was trying to be a more modern kind of Orthodox school, if it were reestablished and set up under proper circumstances and given a decent head who would give it direction. And these gentlemen did that. They called upon one of the greatest Jewish scholars of the early 20th century, a man named Solomon Schechter. And Solomon Schechter came to New York, and with the help of these gentlemen, names like Schiff and Marshall, all the great German Jews who were of Temple Emmanuel, New York, and of all the other great German Jewish organizations, who stood behind this reorganization of the seminary and gave it its strength. It's interesting to read in Louis Marshall's letters, which have just been published, the motives of some of these men, at least, for starting the seminary, or at least restarting the seminary. The truth of the matter is that they wanted to make Americans out of these East Europeans. And the way to do so, therefore, was to find some kind of Jewish self-expression which wouldn't be quite as barbaric as what most of them wanted. They'd have to find something a little more American for them. Therefore, to take a Judaism which was traditionally yet modern and adapted would be fine. So they set up the school, and their plans have succeeded, probably beyond their wildest expectations. Conservative Judaism has by and large been the means through which a great number of Jews have passed and passed into the American scene, both as Americans and Jews. But this is the negative point of view, and I wouldn't want to leave you with that. The conservative movement, while it is true that it has served a certain social function, has also had a kind of an understanding of what it means to be a Jew, which I think is most important. Since it is one of the major answers that the American Jew gives today as to what it means to be a Jew, let me turn to it now and see if in the person of its great early exemplar, Solomon Schechter, I can give you this conservative Jewish point of view. Solomon Schechter is, I think, in many ways a worthwhile symbol of everything good and fine about the conservative movement. It would have been interesting, I think, to have seen him. He is always described as a man with a striking personality, with a magic and charm about him. Besides, the colored portraits that exist of him, a very prominent one of which hangs in the lobby of the Jewish Theological Seminary as you go in, showed him walking around always in his academic robes. I believe he was a Cambridge man, and the Cambridge robes are red. Therefore, he was always wearing the red gown, but he also had apparently a red beard and red hair, and was therefore a rather striking figure. One of the most famous photographs of Schechter shows him with half-lensed glasses, just the lower reading part, and with this great mane of hair lit up by light, peering over the top of the glasses, looking for all the world like some latter-day Socrates or Plato, or, to put it in more Jewish terms, Akiba or Maimonides. The air of the scholar is about the man, of the great human being, of the personality who knows and feels and expresses. In his own way, Schechter exerted a remarkable influence upon conservative Jewry, so much so that to this day members of the older generation will still refer to the Jewish Theological Seminary as Schechter Seminary, much as the seminary on 68th Street is still known to some of the older generation as Wise's, that is, Stephen S. Wise's Seminary, what once was known as the Jewish Institute of Religion. Now let's see. In what way did Schechter, as a human being, show forth the strengths of conservative Judaism? Well, in the first place, if one compares him to Kaufman Kohler, the president of the Hebrew Union College at this same time, it is interesting what their respective spheres of specialization are. Kaufman Kohler, you remember, is a theologian, a man who deals in ideas, creeds, what it means to believe. Solomon Schechter may be something of a theologian too, but mostly he is a student of the rabbinic literature. When Solomon Schechter does write a book on the rabbinic literature, it's not a system, it's not a philosophy, and it's not even modern. It doesn't attempt to bring the rabbis up to date, almost as if it says, why does one have to bring the rabbis up to date? What the rabbis said still makes sense. He called his book of theology Some Aspects. Mind you, not even aspects of rabbinic theology, but some aspects of rabbinic theology, as if to say, gee, who can systematize this? There's so much there. And what does he do? He takes the Mishnah and the Midrash and the Talmudic material and ties a number of intriguing themes together where he feels people have misunderstood Judaism. Take the question of the joy of the Torah. Does a Jew feel that the Torah, the commandments, the law, are a heavy, dry, legal burden which he has to carry? That's what the Christian theologians said. They said it's only Christianity that knows joy and love and light. Judaism is a dry-as-dust religion of rules and regulations and codes, and it's just one bit of jurisprudence from one end to the other. It's not a real religion. Well, said Schechter, let's take a look at what the law is and what it means. And let's talk about the love of the law, the joy of the law, the joy of doing the commandments. And this was the kind of thing that he explicated. Not interested, you see, in setting forth any modern ideas, supposedly, but in saying, why don't we learn what the tradition says? Why don't we learn what it really stands for? Yes, it's very interesting to me that somebody else is tracing the history of ideas and wants to set them in modern times. But I'm interested in presenting the tradition, particularly the legal tradition, particularly that rabbinic tradition in which the great Jewish way of life was explicated and made clear. Solomon Schechter was, in short, a Talmudist. Not simply a Talmudist, but a man of the law and a man of the tradition. Oh, he did many other things as well, to be sure. And one of his great finds had to do with medieval and earlier manuscripts which were discovered. He was a vast and far-ranging scholar. But to contrast him with Kohler is to contrast the man who is seeking for modern expression with the man who is seeking the tradition and what the tradition stands for. A second basis upon which he may be contrasted with Kaufmann Kohler is his attitude toward Zionism. Now, the Reformed Jews were quite clear on the subject. Nationalism as such was wrong and bad, and they weren't going to have any part of it. Judaism was a religion, a faith, a way of believing and thinking, and then, of course, acting upon it. But that's what Judaism was. And anyone who tried to establish Judaism as a nationality, and particularly some kind of nationalism that sought to take the Jews back to Palestine, he was misunderstanding and not defining Judaism correctly. Schechter agreed with this in part. He followed the Reformed Jews halfway. Yes, it is true that Judaism is essentially religious. And insofar as there are Zionists who deny the religious content in Judaism, he is against that kind of Zionism. But on the whole, to say that there is a Jewish people, and that the Jewish people has a certain kind of character and quality, a certain historic continuity, a certain kind of destiny, this, he says, is fairly obvious. And therefore, anything which this people would seek to do to renew itself historically as a people, to establish itself as a people on its own soil, and to bring out the finest and the best of that tradition which had come down through the years, that he was in favor of. He was a Zionist, while objecting to part of Zionist theory in what I think by this time we have seen as a typically American way, while insisting that Judaism was basically a religion. He had a positive attitude toward the entire Zionist movement, and one which has characterized conservative Judaism ever since. But he was not entirely opposed to modernity and the need for change. Schechter was a modern scholar. That is to say, when it came to scholarship, he was willing to use every critical tool to help understand the text. If, for example, he found a reason to believe that the way the biblical text we had in our hands was inaccurate or required change, he would not hesitate to say so. He did not view the traditions of Judaism as so sacrosanct that he could not say they had changed and developed over a period of time. Laws which had been in effect at one time had become obsolete, and other laws had grown up during certain circumstances. He was a modern scholar. The great act of his modern scholarship is his discovery of the famous Geniza in Cairo. Jewish manuscripts of the Middle Ages kept trickling into the market, and they seemed to be coming from Cairo. Schechter went, and after searching around and making friends, he discovered that in the old Jewish synagogue in Cairo, there was a spot in the synagogue where ancient manuscripts had been stored. One doesn't put an old Jewish manuscript, particularly with God's name on it, in the garbage. One has to either bury it or put it away in a hidden place. That's what a geniza means. Schechter was finally able to persuade the Egyptian Jewish authorities to let him go into this part of the old synagogue where the manuscripts had been stored. And sure enough, this is where the antiquities dealers had been filching the manuscripts from. And when he got in there, he discovered the most fabulous collection of Jewish materials of the Middle Ages that the Jewish world had ever seen, from that day to this. Until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, no group of manuscripts had created such a stir. He discovered so many of them that some of them are still not edited and published. And unfortunately, as someone recently wrote, the manuscripts have suffered more in the humidity of New York City in the last 50 years than they suffered during 4 or 5 centuries in Cairo. What Schechter did was to work with a great many of these, first at Cambridge University, where he was a reader, and then here in the United States. He published a great many of them. Now, this was a critical attitude He wasn't afraid of finding old manuscripts which might differ with what this prayer book said, or with even the biblical text itself. He wasn't afraid to study Jewish institutions and see how they had changed and evolved. He knew that change was part of the Jewish way of life. And thus he finally evolved what to him was a solution of the basic problem of conservative Judaism. A problem which still exists for conservative Judaism to our own day. And that is the question of how much and tradition and change. But how much tradition and how much change? Where do we preserve the tradition and where do we change? It may be true that you say to the Reformed Jews, you're not traditional enough, and that you say to the Orthodox Jew, you don't change enough. But just how much do you change from orthodoxy not to be a Reformed Jew? And how much do you stick to the tradition in order not to be a Reformed Jew? What is the guiding line of this change and tradition, which keeps you conservative, and which makes either one of the other two movements undesirable? Schechter gave the first and the great and early answer to this question. He said, in what is a most peculiar English but a lovely Hebrew usage, a traditional one, whenever we are confronted with a problem as to how much we should change or how much we should hold back, we should follow the usage of Klal Yisrael, the entirety of Israel. We should try to see what the Jewish synagogue as a whole, he called it later in his organization, the united synagogue. The synagogue's united. What are they doing? What are they able to do? What are they standing for? And that's the basis upon which we can decide. After all, it's not just a matter of a few scholars in an academy. It's not a matter for one thinker or a court deciding what needs to be done. It's us and the Jewish people as a living entity going on. He called this and translated it Catholic Israel. The usage is correct. Catholic means universal, all-embracing, the Jews as a whole. And Catholic Israel, which has been a somewhat difficult phrase both for conservative Jews and modern Jews to swallow, Catholic Israel became Schechter's answer to this difficult problem of conservative Judaism. But I said it was a continuing problem because while it may have solved things in Schechter's time, as time has passed, it wouldn't do for the conservative Jew today. In Schechter's time, it was quite clear, for example, that as against the Reformed Jews, Catholic Israel was in favor of kashrus. In Schechter's time, most Jews still kept kashrus, or talked about keeping kashrus, or at least did something about keeping kosher. It was quite clear, there wasn't very much question about it. There were some Reformed Jews on the periphery who didn't do it, or people who lived out of areas where kosher meat was available, but by and large, the overwhelming majority of Jews admitted that one should keep kosher. And on the other hand, the overwhelming majority of Jews admitted that one didn't have to keep all the orthodox and traditional laws, such as, for example, wearing a garment of mixed wool and linen. This was not the kind of law which had continuity and meaning in our time. By and large, the overwhelming majority of Jews, perhaps even centuries before, had begun to disregard the ordinance, and there was no particular reason really to keep it up. Here was a guide, a basis which he could follow. But supposing the conservative Jew tried to follow it today, supposing the conservative Jew to this day said, oh yes, we know just how much to change and just how much to hold back because we follow the people. What would happen? What would happen would be that there would be probably no difference between conservative and Reformed Jews. Because by and large, as one begins to take the statistics, one discovers that conservative Jews eat as much non-kosher food as Reformed Jews, with a certain amount of statistical difference. That they work as much on the Sabbath, that they do not observe the holidays in the traditional manner in almost the same way. The spokesmen of conservative Judaism admit in our own day that one of the major problems has been the rapid shift in the way in which Catholic Israel has been willing to understand what it considers to be Jewish. So, while Schechter's view was helpful in its day, it has not continued to be helpful to our own day. But it is quite clear that conservative Judaism brought something into the American Jewish scene which hadn't been there before, and which without conservative Judaism, or rather without the impact of the immigrants who made conservative Judaism what it was, would probably never have appeared. And this was the sense of the Jewish people as a people. It was a sense of the value and the meaning of the tradition. It was a sense of the importance of continuity. American Judaism was so busy in its reform wing, in becoming part of the American community, that it had kind of cut off its roots. It had cut off its understanding of what the group existence of the Jew meant. This, the East European immigration restored to it. Perhaps it is a little sentimental to refer to it this way, but in a way it was an act of providence, this East European immigration. Why do I say that? I say that because you will recall that the problem which we set for ourselves at the beginning of this course was what happened when the Jews left the ghetto. They left the ghetto at the beginning of the 19th century, in the early 1800s in Germany. They came out into a world and they had tried various paths and procedures to adjust to the modern world. All of those paths we have been reviewing until now. But these hundreds of thousands of East European Jews were God's second chance for us. All the answers which had been worked out up until this point were waiting for this new mass which came out of the ghetto. They were given a second try at the problem of how does the Jew adjust to the modern world. And waiting for them were all the answers of liberal religion, of Zionism, of everything else that we have been speaking about. And they were the ones who had the opportunity to benefit them from a century of previous experience, and to benefit in this country which had given them an unparalleled opportunity. America was different, according to what we were saying last week, in what it made possible for the Jew economically and religiously and politically and spiritually. And it was different too in that all of a sudden, into this real freedom came a new group of Jews from the ghetto to take up the problem of adjustment to the American scene. In a way, the problems that we still suffer from in American Jewry. And the whole reason why one was able to organize this series of lectures around this theme has been that that problem of the 1810s and the 1820s of Germany is still the problem of the Jew of the United States. We Jews of the United States, by and large, either immigrants ourselves, mostly from East European countries, or the children of immigrants, or maybe by now the grandchildren of immigrants. We are but out of the ghetto a generation or two, and we are reliving the same process and the same problem. Our problem is still the basic problem of the last century and a half. How can a man live in a free society and still be a Jew? One thing we have learned, at least, that it must be religious, and yet it must have some relationship to the Jewish people. And out of this basis, and upon this understanding, we will then, in the subsequent lectures dealing with the United States, move forward to see how these ideas developed as the American Jewish community itself developed. And now we have a few moments left for questions. I hate to say this again, but I'm not there yet. I haven't gotten there. I've only gotten till 1925 in a way. I've only gotten to the point where the immigration is cut off. You see, would you mind, since you have been here so regularly, you will be back again, I hope, and the rest of you too, a cordial invitation is extended. There is another lecture coming on Conservative Judaism, which will bring us up to date. And by the way, may I at this time point out to you a very curious editorial omission from the list of lectures, which it will be very interesting someday to discover why it was done. The last lecture, which was entitled Reform Judaism Today, we do our last three are Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism Today. Every one of those has a man's name after it. But there's a man's name missing after the Reform Judaism one. I can't understand for the life of me why it was left out. And the man's name is Martin Buber. I couldn't discuss Reform Judaism with you without discussing Martin Buber. And I would be very interesting to know why Martin Buber's name was left off. But at any rate, when we discuss Conservative Judaism and Mordecai Kaplan, in the course of which we shall also talk about Abraham Joshua Heschel, although I think Kaplan is the key figure around whom it will be best to arrange the exposition, it will be possible for me to talk about what the conservative movement is today and where it's going and what its problems are, as the following week I shall then do the same for Reform Judaism in terms of Martin Buber. Yes, the word assimilate has several meanings. The East European Jew wanted to be an American. He really did. But he was very often willing to give up a generation, to let one generation kill itself so that the next generation could become Americans. In a way, the symbolic figure of the East European is that parent who works and sweats and slaves so that his child can finish college. A generation comes and immigrates and practically kills itself so that another generation can have the opportunity. That generation then spurns the older generation, which didn't want to take time off from work to become American or to master what the newer generation was becoming. So therefore, they get into the American scene, but then they don't want to be Jews. And it's only later that they begin to come back, and of course their children begin to think of being Jews. Yes, they wanted to become part of America, but they didn't want to give up their Jewish identity, not only in religious terms, but in terms of the group solidarity of the Jews. Yes?
Well, as I look at the history of the Jews in America, to me, the greatest lack has been the lack of Jewish education. In other words, one would almost say that never before had the educated been so ignorant. The very educated people who would be miserably ashamed of being ignorant in other areas are almost proud sometimes of being ignorant Jewishly. And I think this has been the real deterioration of Reform Judaism. That somehow their children have not gotten this education that I feel is so important. I know because I'm one of those.
Yeah, well, I don't know that you need to feel so terribly bad about it, even though anyone who feels bad about Jewish education and therefore goes out to educate himself more Jewishly is to be commended. I think that's correct. I really don't know if it's true that Jews are less well educated today than they once were. But it depends what you mean by the word education. If what you mean by the word education is Jewish education or education in Jewish religious law or Jewish religious practice, then it's quite correct. Most of us know a great deal less today about Jewish religious practice than most Jews knew in Eastern Europe. On the other hand, most Jews in the United States are better educated in terms of functioning as a full human being than most Jews were in Poland. I don't know if that makes them better human beings, but it certainly opens a wider range of experience and knowledge and opportunity to them. If we can graft on to this wider human knowledge the Jewish values and standards and goals, then we will have achieved the kind of fusion which we want. Now, this is a problem which we shall also come to later in the course. What does one do, therefore? Does one therefore do what the Eastern European tradition had to do? Namely, give one's child a totally Jewish education, or an almost totally Jewish education. A professor of mine who was a great genius at the Slobodka Yeshiva Said sometimes the Americans think that everyone who was at the yeshiva knew something. It's not true. 90% of them didn't understand what they were talking about. They went through words and they could recite and they could talk and they could fool with one another and argue with it. But insight, understand, they didn't have. It's no different here than there, he says. There are only a few people who ever really know and ever really understand. I think sometimes we are perhaps a little more unhappy with ourselves than we need to be. This has been a great accomplishment in a way to educate the American Jew the way he's been educated. Not Jewishly, to be sure. But are we willing to give up the American school system? Are we willing to give up the education in general culture? Now that's our problem. And by the way, it comes down to that finally after a while. If you don't put the time in on it, you're not going to accomplish what once was accomplished. The Reform Jews were the ones who made the initial commitment to the American Jewish public school, the American public school. They were the ones who set the pace in that regard. And it's interesting that the Conservative Jews followed. While they wanted after-school Hebrew schools, and Solomon Schechter established a teacher's school for that, there was never any question on the part of either the Reform or the Conservative Jews, by and large, that they wanted their children going to the American public school system and becoming educated in an American way. And the critical problem for both these liberal groups has been, is it possible to educate a Jew properly if his primary education is carried out under non-Jewish auspices? It is an unanswered and a tremendous question on the Jewish scene today.
But I feel that the conservative movement in a way is a very great service because it refuses to negate that vast background and culture that Judaism and in addition is open-minded enough to make a little bit of change.
Yes, I think you express it very well. This is exactly why the conservative movement has attracted the large numbers of people it has. It's no larger than the Reform movement today. They both have somewhere near 1 million Jews as part of them. Each, therefore, is about 20% of the American scene. Yes, that's exactly why many Jews find themselves very comfortable in conservatism. They feel that they're holding on to the tradition, and they're not rushing forward too fast, that they're holding on to enough to stay Jews, and yet at the same time be modern and American. But it would be very interesting to know how much is that much. And it would also be very interesting to know what the conservative Jews would do if there were no Reform Jews around. If there were no Reform Jews around to lead the way and pioneer and take all the blame for going too far, what would the conservative Jews do? It's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to it.
I sometimes wonder what people think we teach our children in the Reform temples and the Reform Sunday schools and the Reform after school schools. We have all of those, and we try to give them some tradition. I haven't been in a conservative, so I don't know. We try to give them some Hebrew. We try to, by having them at the services, get as much knowledge as they can of the tradition that way too. We are not simply Jews who are partaking in the American scene and trying to forget we're Jews.
Yeah. I think, however, that if you don't mind, we had better stay out of the contemporary scene and go back before 1925.
Well, I wasn't I
recognize that I have been giving the earlier Reform Jews somewhat short shrift. I'm doing that because I don't know whether anyone has been able to identify my own particular stand in the course of the enormous themes here. I've been accused of being everything I know when I talk, but I want to make certain that you understand the problems connected with each one of these movements. The Reform Jews had their problems. I think the conservative Jews have their problems. And the Orthodox Jews, I probably don't have to tell you, Herman Woke to the contrary notwithstanding, because most of you are probably not ready to take upon yourselves now what the tradition calls the yoke, a good word, the yoke of the traditional law. Therefore, I think it's important for us, even as we were asking questions of the Zionist ideologists, to ask questions of these ideologists. And since sooner or later we are going to end up with the liberal religious movements, in my opinion, conservative and Reform Judaism are both varieties of Reform Judaism. Once one separates from the divine law and says that the law changes and develops as a human agency, you're a Reform Jew. And there are some Reform Jews a little more radical, and there are some Reform Jews who are a little more traditional, but that's all in my opinion. And as I shall say when we get to the end of the course, if there weren't different real estate, and if there weren't different bureaucracies, and if we hadn't had the legacy behind us of the Russians and the Germans hating one another, it would be very hard, except on one ideological basis, which I shall discuss with you. It would be very hard to set forth a basis for there being a conservative and a reform movement in the United States. There's only one really good reason that I know of, and I'll be perfectly frank with you, and that good reason is this. For some reason, the bigger an institution one gets, the less people participate in it. And we have too many big synagogues today. A lot of medium-sized, not small, but a lot of medium-sized synagogues are much better than a few real big ones. Therefore, if it takes two movements, conservative and reform, to give us the extra synagogues we need to give more Jews something to do in order to be Jewish, that's enough reason for me. But I'm not sure, except on the one ideological basis I will discuss with you later, that I'm willing to take it terribly much more seriously than that. And from my point of view, one of the great problems in the United States is our beginning to talk as if we were three separate religions: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. If it keeps up this way, we'll begin to have the problem of intermarriage all over again. We finally got so that the Galicianas and the Litvaks would marry. And then the East Europeans and the Germans. And we're beginning to get a certain kind of departmentalization and sectarianization of Jewish life, which is not healthy. And I, for one, refuse to be part of it. Therefore, I prefer to see what is good in all the movements and criticize all the movements, and mostly to help you think of what you consider to be the appropriate identity for a Jew in the modern world. We shall pick up next week.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.